The words Declaration of Incapacity were printed across the top of the document lying on Vanessa Sterling's wedding bed. Julian sat on one side in a black executive suit. Isabella sat beside him in ivory silk, a pen resting above the final signature line. Between them sat a future they intended to steal. The document would declare Vanessa mentally incapable of managing the family trust, removing her authority and transferring control into hands that had spent years benefiting from her work. A red folder remained tucked beneath her arm. A red wax-sealed envelope rested inside it. Julian looked up first. Isabella froze. Vanessa studied the signatures, the missing witness section, and the confidence on both faces. Then she understood. Not an affair. An erasure. The calculation began. Vanessa closed the bedroom door behind her without offering a single question. She crossed the hallway at a steady pace and entered the private study that nobody used except her. 10 years earlier, she had designed the trust structure that protected every major asset connected to Sterling wealth. Julian liked to stand at the front of the empire. Vanessa had built the walls behind it. Keep the share. She unlocked a fireproof drawer and removed the red wax-sealed envelope. Inside sat the golden share certificate. The paper looked ordinary. Its authority was not. She reviewed the embedded governance provisions she had drafted years before. Any verified attempt to fraudulently remove the golden shareholder from trust oversight would trigger a sequence of automatic reviews, liquidation protocols, and capital protection mechanisms. Julian knew the trust existed. He did not understand how it breathed. Read the trigger. Vanessa opened a secured terminal and logged into a private governance archive. One by one, she verified authorization histories, succession protections, and covenant layers attached to the family trust. Everything remained intact. The system had not been compromised. That was enough. Her phone illuminated with incoming messages. Anniversary greetings. Investor invitations. Family notifications. She deleted them without opening a single one. Then she began removing herself. From every location Julian would search first. Shared calendars disappeared. Personal forwarding routes vanished. Secondary communication channels were terminated. Digital breadcrumbs went dark. So she moved. A final review revealed exactly what she expected. Julian had prepared forged medical support documents, but he had never obtained the one thing that mattered: her presence. Without that requirement, his plan might have succeeded. With it, he had stepped directly onto a mechanism designed to defend itself. Vanessa leaned back and studied the certificate again. She felt no urge to return upstairs. No desire to argue. The truth already existed on paper. Soon the system would discover it as well. She opened a secure governance portal and entered a sequence known only to the original architect of the trust. The first protective review activated. Quietly. Permanently. Somewhere above her, Julian believed he was removing her from the structure. Vanessa closed the archive and locked the certificate back inside the red envelope. He had miscalculated. By the time he realized what the golden share actually controlled, the system would already be answering a different question: who had tried to destroy the person who built it? Vanessa spent the next morning in a private residence nearly 40 miles from the Sterling estate, a property held through an older trust structure that very few people knew existed. The silence there felt different. Not comforting. Honest. Her laptop remained open on a long oak table, while governance reports continued flowing into the secure archive she controlled. The first review protocol had already begun moving through the system. No public alarms. No visible damage. Yet, she read every update carefully, then set the screen aside. Something else demanded her attention. Upstairs, inside a cedar-lined wardrobe she had not opened in years, a memory waited. Vanessa pulled out an archived family photograph and studied it for several seconds. Her father stood between two daughters. One carried ambition. The other carried responsibility. Back then, the difference had seemed harmless. Then she opened a secure image folder retrieved from the Sterling Estate's internal cameras. Isabella appeared on the screen wearing the red silk robe their father had left to Vanessa before his death. The robe had never been expensive. That was not the point. It represented trust, legacy, memory. Vanessa stared at the image without moving. Then she understood. The deepest wound had never been the forged declaration. It had never been Julian sitting beside another woman. It was the realization that neither of them wanted what she could give. They wanted what she had built. That was different. The bedroom was not chosen by accident. The robe was not chosen by accident. Every detail carried a message. Replacement. That was enough. Vanessa closed the image file and leaned back. For years, she had believed loyalty could be created through protection. She protected Julian when markets turned unstable. She protected Isabella when poor decisions threatened to damage her reputation. She absorbed risk so other people could enjoy certainty. Looking back, she saw a pattern she had ignored. They accepted protection. They never valued the protector. The realization arrived quietly. It stayed. No more permission. Vanessa returned to work. She opened a restricted governance ledger connected to the golden share. Unlike ordinary ownership rights, the certificate granted structural authority over succession pathways and emergency trust responses. It was less visible than wealth and far more powerful. She reviewed every section personally. Capital relationships remained active. Historical authorizations remained documented. The institutional network she had spent a decade cultivating still recognized her authorship. Nobody could forge that. Nobody could inherit it by marriage. Nobody could steal it by wearing a robe. Preserve that. A notification arrived from the private banker requesting clarification regarding unusual governance activity surrounding sterling funds. Vanessa did not answer immediately. Instead, she created a separate archive documenting every action connected to the attempted incapacity filing. Dates, authorizations, draft histories, signature chains, facts only. She felt no urgency to defend herself. The structure would do that soon enough. Outside, the afternoon sun crossed the property and disappeared behind distant trees. Vanessa finally responded to the banker with a single sentence requesting preservation of all trust-related communications pending review. Then she encrypted the archive and secured a second copy. The emotional chapter had ended. The professional one was beginning. Somewhere inside the Sterling estate, Julian still believed control came from occupying the largest chair in the room. Vanessa now understood something he never would. Power did not belong to the person who sat at the table. It belonged to the person who designed it. She secured the file. Then she began planning the next move. 3 days after disappearing from Julian's reach, Vanessa Sterling stopped thinking like a betrayed wife and returned to thinking like the architect of a multi-generational trust system. The distinction mattered. Emotion could explain the attack against her. Governance would determine its outcome. She arrived at a secure records facility just after sunrise carrying the red wax-sealed envelope and a tablet containing 20 years of trust documentation. Most people imagined wealth as bank accounts, mansions, and investment portfolios. Vanessa knew better. Wealth survived through structure. The Sterling fortune did not exist because money had accumulated. It existed because rules had been written. She had written many of them herself. Keep reading. She separated the structure into 4 layers: the dynasty trust, the trustee authority map, the trust protector clauses, and the beneficiary control hierarchy. Each layer had a different purpose. The dynasty trust preserved capital across generations. The trustee authority map controlled who could approve movement of assets. The trust protector clauses existed for one reason only: to stop a powerful insider from abusing the system. The beneficiary hierarchy defined who could benefit, but not who could command. At the center sat the golden share. Publicly, it appeared ceremonial. Internally, it functioned as a constitutional safeguard. No successor could remove the holder through incapacity claims, governance amendments, or authority transfers without triggering independent verification procedures. Julian had always dismissed those provisions as excessive. Vanessa remembered every argument. He wanted efficiency. He wanted speed. He wanted fewer approvals. What he really wanted was freedom from accountability. The pattern was impossible to miss now. She continued reviewing historical records. Succession protocols, liquidity covenants, capital preservation clauses, and emergency governance pathways all pointed to the same hidden truth. Every section revealed the same truth. Years ago, Vanessa had designed the trust as if she expected someone powerful to abuse it one day. That assumption was protecting her now. Preserve that. By midday, she began assembling a chronology of Julian's actions. The forged incapacity filing was only the final move. The deeper story stretched back years. Requests to remove approval layers. Attempts to consolidate voting authority. Pressure to reduce oversight mechanisms. Complaints whenever institutional reviews delayed his decisions. Vanessa saw more than ambition. She saw insecurity disguised as leadership. Julian never hated the rules because they were inefficient. He hated them because they reminded him that someone else had built the system he depended on. There it was, the first clear outline of his weakness. He could tolerate competition. He could not tolerate dependence. Vanessa created a separate file documenting every occasion he had attempted to bypass trust safeguards. The pattern connected perfectly with recent events. Each failure increased his frustration. Each safeguard strengthened his resentment. Eventually, he stopped trying to work around the architecture and started trying to remove the architect. That realization changed everything. He had miscalculated. Late that afternoon, a message arrived from the compliance officer overseeing one of the trust's largest asset groups. Routine review requests were expanding into broader governance examinations. Nothing accusatory, nothing dramatic, just process. Yet Vanessa understood what process meant. Systems rarely collapsed from a single explosion. They unraveled because questions multiplied, faster than answers. She responded with documentation supporting every historical authorization connected to her role, and then closed the communication. No persuasion, no defense, facts only. The strongest position in governance was never outrage. It was accuracy. As evening approached, Vanessa placed the golden share certificate back inside the red envelope and secured it in the archive. Across the country, Julian was almost certainly trying to prove he controlled the empire. Vanessa now knew the truth he spent years hiding from himself. The empire worked because he stood on foundations built by someone he could never fully replace. That weakness remained invisible for now. Soon it would not be. Then she finalized the file. The cruelest betrayals do not always arrive as shouting. Sometimes they arrive as policy, signed in the silence of a room you once called home. Most people imagine trust as an emotion. In Vanessa Sterling's world, trust was a structure. It lived inside documents, approvals, governance layers, and responsibilities carried year after year without applause. That was why the betrayal cut so deeply. Julian had not merely violated a marriage. He had attempted to weaponize the very system she built to protect everyone connected to it. The attack was personal. The method was institutional. That combination was far more dangerous. Then she understood. The moment someone tries to erase you through paperwork, the battle is no longer about affection. It is about authorship. Vanessa arrived at a private trust governance chamber located inside an understated building 12 miles from downtown. No luxury branding marked the entrance. No reporters waited outside. Real power rarely advertised itself. The conference room contained only a long table, secure terminals, and access to decades of trust records. She preferred it that way. The room rewarded facts instead of performance. Keep it factual. Throughout the morning, Vanessa met with the senior lawyer, the compliance officer, and the private banker. None of them arrived because of friendship. They arrived because governance protocols required review when irregular activity appeared inside a trust. Structure. Vanessa appreciated that distinction. Personal loyalty could fail. Professional duty could not. One by one, she presented verified timelines, authorization histories, and documentation connected to the attempted incapacity filing. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. The evidence spoke clearly enough. What struck Vanessa most was not the seriousness of the situation, but the predictability of it. Julian had spent years trying to simplify systems he found inconvenient. Every safeguard irritated him because every safeguard reminded him that someone else's judgment stood between him and absolute control. At the time, Vanessa interpreted that frustration as impatience. Now she recognized it as something deeper. Fear. Fear rarely announced itself directly. It disguised itself as confidence, authority, and ambition. Julian's version wore expensive suits and occupied executive offices. Yet beneath it remained the same insecurity. He could not tolerate depending on the person he secretly believed was smarter than he was. There it was again. The weakness remained hidden from almost everyone else. Not from Vanessa. Read the pattern. By late afternoon, the governance chamber began receiving responses from various review departments connected to Sterling assets. Requests for clarification expanded. Historical approvals were examined. Capital partners asked additional questions. No accusations emerged. No dramatic declarations appeared. Process was simply doing what process was designed to do. Vanessa reviewed every update carefully and offered documentation when necessary. Nothing more. She never attempted to influence outcomes. Systems worked best when left alone. As evenings settled across the city, the senior lawyer placed a final review schedule on the table and quietly departed. The compliance officer followed soon after. Vanessa remained alone inside the chamber, studying the network she had spent 10 years building. The trust was not defending her because she was a victim. It was defending itself because integrity had been challenged. That distinction mattered. She secured the files, locked the archive, and placed the red wax-sealed envelope beside her tablet. Somewhere beyond those walls, Julian still believed he could manage the narrative. Vanessa was no longer interested in narratives. She was interested in consequences. The system was ready. Julian Sterling believed the crisis had stabilized. That belief became the most dangerous asset on his balance sheet. 5 days after Vanessa vanished, he entered a private investor briefing at Sterling Funds wearing a charcoal suit and the confidence of a man who assumed every problem could still be managed from the head of the table. The room responded the way it always had. Executives nodded. Reports were distributed. Forecasts appeared on screens. Outwardly, nothing seemed different. That illusion comforted him. It should have concerned him. Across the presentation, Julian repeatedly referred to future restructuring plans, governance simplification initiatives, and expanded capital deployment strategies. The language sounded decisive. The room remained polite. Yet subtle changes had begun appearing around him. Questions arrived more frequently. Follow-up requests became more detailed. Several investors asked for supporting documentation before approving routine actions. Small things. Easy to dismiss. Julian dismissed them. That was his mistake. Keep moving. Isabella occupied a seat near the front of the room dressed in an ivory designer suit that projected the image she had always wanted. Future influence. Future prestige. Future belonging. She had spent years observing wealth from the edges of powerful rooms. Now she believed she was finally entering one. During a break, she spoke confidently about upcoming transitions inside the Sterling structure. Nobody challenged her directly. Nobody endorsed her either. The distinction escaped her. Meanwhile, Julian continued presenting quarterly projections. Every chart reflected financial strength. Every metric suggested stability. Yet one question disrupted his rhythm. A senior investor asked whether the current governance reviews would affect long-term trust administration. The room became noticeably quieter. Julian answered immediately. Too quickly. He described the reviews as routine and unnecessary to discuss further. Then, he redirected the conversation. Most people accepted the response. A few exchanged brief glances. Vanessa's name had not been mentioned. Still, her absence had entered the room. There it was. Later that afternoon, Julian met privately with the investor relations officer and reviewed external communications. Several institutional partners had requested clarification regarding trust oversight procedures. Again, nothing dramatic. No accusations. No public controversy. Process. Julian felt irritation building beneath his calm exterior. For years, he had tolerated governance mechanisms that slowed decisions and complicated transactions. Now those same mechanisms seemed determined to challenge him at every turn. He interpreted the resistance as bureaucracy. The truth was more uncomfortable. The system remembered who built it. He did not want to think about that. Not today. By evening, Julian returned to the Sterling estate and found Isabella waiting beside the terrace overlooking the property. She spoke enthusiastically about future plans, social positioning, and opportunities once the transition was complete. Julian listened without fully hearing her. His attention remained fixed on a compliance update displayed on his phone. Another review request. Another procedural delay. Another reminder that authority inside the trust structure remained more complicated than ownership. Isabella finally asked the question he least wanted to hear. Why did every major safeguard seem connected to Vanessa? Julian's expression hardened for a fraction of a second. Then it disappeared. Too late. The reaction revealed more than the answer ever could. He spoke about legal history, administrative design, and legacy governance decisions. Technical explanations. Safe explanations. Yet beneath every word sat a truth he refused to acknowledge. Vanessa had never merely managed the system. She had authored it. That reality followed him into the night. The first cracks remained small, but they were no longer invisible. The system did not strike all at once. It moved the way well-designed systems always moved, through sequence, verification, and consequence. 7 days after the forged incapacity filing, Sterling funds began encountering obstacles that could not be solved by confidence or public image. The first signs appeared inside routine operations. Capital deployment approvals took longer than expected. Several asset transfers entered secondary review. A refinancing package connected to one of the trust's largest holdings was placed on administrative hold pending governance clarification. None of those developments threatened immediate collapse. Together, they created friction. Friction became delay. Delay became attention. Attention became risk. Then the questions multiplied. A compliance review triggered another review. A governance inquiry generated requests for historical authorization records. Independent auditors sought documentation supporting succession pathways tied to several trust-controlled entities. Everything followed established procedure. Nothing was dramatic. That made it far more dangerous. Activate review. Julian spent most of the week moving from meeting to meeting, attempting to contain growing uncertainty. Each conversation felt manageable in isolation. Taken together, they formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. Institutional partners were no longer accepting broad assurances. They wanted records, timelines, verification. The same systems Vanessa had spent years reinforcing were now demanding proof. Proof required history. History favored the architect. Inside the private governance chamber, Vanessa monitored developments without interfering. She understood exactly what was happening. The golden share had not destroyed anything. It had simply activated protective scrutiny against an attempted act of internal fraud. The trust was defending itself. Every additional review emerged from rules that already existed. Rules Julian had repeatedly tried to weaken. Rules he never fully understood. Keep watching. A scheduled capital release tied to a luxury property portfolio failed to clear because the approval chain required historical confirmation from the golden shareholder. A private acquisition vehicle paused automatically. A trustee replacement request entered dispute status. For the first time, Sterling Funds did not simply face questions. It faced locked doors. One of Sterling Fund's largest capital partners postponed participation in a planned investment vehicle until governance questions were resolved. The decision was procedural. That made it harder to fight. Yet the market interpreted it differently. Confidence operates on perception as much as performance. When hesitation appears, people start asking why. More calls followed. More reviews. More requests. Meanwhile, Isabella discovered that her situation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Several social invitations quietly disappeared. A foundation committee delayed her membership application. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt measured. Nobody accused her of wrongdoing. Nobody needed to. Reputation rarely collapses through confrontation. Sometimes it erodes through distance. She began asking Julian harder questions. He offered fewer answers. By Friday afternoon, the investor relations officer delivered a summary report showing a growing list of counterparties seeking governance clarification before moving forward with future commitments. Julian reviewed the document twice, then a third time. The numbers remained strong. The assets remained substantial. Yet momentum had shifted. For the first time, he faced a problem money could not immediately solve. The issue was credibility. The issue was authorship. The issue was trust. There it was. Late that evening, another message arrived from a review committee overseeing one of the trust's most valuable holdings. Additional historical documentation would be required before approval could proceed. Routine language. Routine procedure. Yet Julian stared at the request longer than necessary because he recognized something he had spent years denying. Many of those records existed because Vanessa had personally designed the framework governing them. The system was no longer asking whether he owned the empire. It was asking whether he understood it. The answer was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. And somewhere beyond his reach, Vanessa continued waiting. Patiently. The architecture was finally speaking for itself. Julian Sterling had spent years believing. Authority created loyalty. The 7th day after the governance reviews expanded was when that illusion finally began to break apart. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly, the way real power leaves a room. He arrived at Sterling Funds shortly before 8 in the morning, expecting another difficult day of explanations and procedural delays. Instead, he walked into something far more unsettling. Indifference. The executive assistant who once anticipated every request before it was spoken now waited for instructions like any ordinary employee. The investor relations officer delivered reports without offering reassurance. Several department heads joined meetings remotely despite being in the building. Small details, easy to dismiss individually, impossible to ignore together. No one moved. Julian reviewed the latest governance summary while seated at the head of the conference table. Additional asset groups had entered secondary oversight review. Capital commitments remained postponed. Strategic partnerships were requesting enhanced verification procedures before moving forward. Every document used careful language. Every response remained professional. Yet behind the professionalism sat a growing absence of confidence. For years, people trusted the system because they trusted the people associated with it. Now those two things were separating. Keep reading. Around midday, Julian met with the private banker overseeing several family-linked structures. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. What stayed with him afterward was not the content, but the tone. The banker remained polite, respectful, neutral. Then the banker delivered the sentence Julian could not absorb. We need Ms. Sterling's authorization history before any replacement structure can be recognized. Not his signature, not his title, hers. That neutrality felt colder than hostility. There were no promises, no attempts to calm concerns. Only process, only procedure. Julian left the meeting carrying a realization he did not want to name. Authority had become conditional on the woman he tried to erase. Later that afternoon, Isabella arrived unexpectedly at the office. She no longer carried the confidence she displayed only a week earlier. Several charitable organizations had quietly distanced themselves from her. Invitations were disappearing. Professional introductions were becoming difficult to arrange. People still smiled. People still spoke politely. Yet access was evaporating. Reputation moved through invisible networks. Those networks were beginning to close. She demanded answers. Julian offered explanations. Then Isabella noticed a legal response draft lying open on his desk. Her name appeared beside the incapacity filing timeline. His did not. The document described her as the individual who introduced the declaration into the household record. For several seconds, she simply stared at the page. Julian reached for the file too late. The future she thought she was inheriting had become a liability trail. She was not a successor. She was a shield. Neither sounded convincing. The conversation ended when Isabella realized silence was the only protection Julian had left to offer her. There it was. By evening, a comprehensive governance report landed on Julian's desk. The document contained dozens of references to historical trust authorizations, structural protections, succession mechanisms, and emergency oversight provisions. Vanessa's fingerprints seemed to appear everywhere. Not literally, architecturally. The deeper the reviews traveled into the trust system, the more obvious her role became. Julian studied page after page. An uncomfortable truth emerged. He could explain the empire's performance. He could not explain its design. That distinction cut deeper than any financial loss. He had spent years presenting himself as the central force behind sterling wealth. Now, every investigation, every review, every institutional inquiry was uncovering evidence that someone else had built the framework allowing that wealth to function. He had miscalculated. Near sunset, Julian stood alone inside his office overlooking the city. For the first time, he allowed himself to ask a question he had avoided for years. What if Vanessa had always been the reason the system worked? The thought arrived like a fracture running beneath polished stone. He immediately rejected it, then reconsidered it, then rejected it again. The cycle repeated because the answer frightened him. His greatest fear had never been losing money. His greatest fear was being exposed as dependent on the woman he tried to erase. That was the wound. That was the weakness. And now it was visible. Around him, the empire still stood. Yet something essential had already left. The certainty was gone. Soon, everything else would follow. Julian found Vanessa 12 days after the first governance review had begun. Not at the Sterling estate. Not at a corporate headquarters. He found her inside the same private trust governance chamber where she had spent weeks watching the system respond exactly as it had been designed to respond. The room was quiet, functional, unimpressed by status. A long table separated them. Vanessa sat at one end wearing a sharp red blazer. a tablet resting beside the familiar red wax-sealed envelope. Julian stood for several seconds before taking a seat. For the first time since their marriage began, he entered a room where neither wealth nor title gave him an advantage. The difference showed. He looked older. Not physically, structurally. Too late. Julian began carefully. He spoke about misunderstandings, unintended consequences, and the need to stabilize what remained of the Sterling legacy. He avoided the word fraud. He avoided the forged incapacity filing. Vanessa noticed that too. Even in collapse, Julian was still trying to leave someone else inside the damage. Isabella was not in the room. That absence said more than any apology could have. Instead, he focused on preservation, reputation, continuity. Vanessa listened without interruption. The silence forced him to keep talking. Eventually, he reached the request hidden beneath every other sentence. He wanted her cooperation. He wanted her influence. Most of all, he wanted her to stop the system from revealing what it was uncovering. There it was. Vanessa opened the red envelope and removed the golden share certificate. She placed it on the table between them. Julian's eyes moved immediately toward the document. Years earlier, he had treated the certificate as ceremonial, an inconvenience, a relic. Now it had become the most important paper in his world. Read it again. Her voice remained calm. Julian looked down. The same governance provisions he once dismissed now sat before him in precise language. Emergency review authority, fraud response triggers, capital protection mechanisms, succession safeguards. Every clause had survived because Vanessa insisted they remain untouched. Every clause was now operating exactly as intended. Julian pushed the document aside and attempted a different approach. He argued that the trust needed decisive leadership. He argued that extraordinary circumstances required flexibility. He argued that technical structures should never outweigh practical realities. The words sounded reasonable. Vanessa recognized them instantly. They were the same arguments he had used for years whenever a safeguard prevented him from exercising unchecked authority. She studied him for several moments before speaking. Not anger. Not revenge. Accuracy. You never wanted power. You wanted freedom from needing me. The room became still. Julian's expression changed before he could stop it. That single sentence reached the place he had spent years protecting. Vanessa continued. You could tolerate competition. You could tolerate criticism. What you could never tolerate was dependence. Every approval you resented. Every safeguard you tried to remove. Every governance layer you attacked. They reminded you that the system worked because someone else designed it, not because you owned it. He said nothing. For the first time, there was nothing useful to say. The truth was too specific. Too complete. Vanessa gathered the certificate and returned it to the envelope. Then she stood. You thought removing my name would make the architecture yours. It only proved you never understood it. That was enough. Julian remained seated as she walked toward the exit. He did not ask her to stay. He did not offer another argument. Behind him sat the empire he had spent years claiming as proof of his strength. In front of him sat the evidence that it had never been built by confidence alone. Vanessa reached the door and left the room first. Julian remained exactly where he was, surrounded by structures he could no longer control and truths he could no longer avoid. Freedom is the only currency that a billionaire can never freeze and a sister can never steal. People often imagine justice arriving in the same room where betrayal happened. They imagine dramatic confrontations, public humiliation, or a final speech powerful enough to balance every wound. Real life rarely works that way. The true price of betrayal is usually paid later, quietly, through consequences that continue long after the original decision has been made. Julian Sterling learned that lesson through governance reviews, lost credibility, and the gradual disappearance of institutional trust. Isabella learned it through exclusion, distance, and the realization that borrowed status evaporates when its source collapses. Vanessa learned something different. She learned that losing faith in people does not require losing faith in herself. That distinction changed everything. The future began there. 6 months later, the newly established Sterling Devereux Foundation opened its headquarters in a restored historic building overlooking a riverfront district nearly 70 miles from the estate where the story had begun. The building was not a monument to revenge. Vanessa refused to build one. Instead, it became a center dedicated to transparent wealth stewardship, trust governance education, and long-term philanthropic planning. The mission reflected the lesson she valued most. Sustainable power required accountability, not performance. Open the doors. On the morning of the inauguration, foundation representatives, institutional partners, and governance leaders filled the main hall. Large windows flooded the space with natural light. Historical trust archives occupied one wing. Educational programs occupied another. Everything had been designed with intention. Vanessa moved through the building greeting guests, reviewing final preparations, and answering questions from foundation partners. She carried herself differently now. Not lighter, stronger. The difference mattered. Across the room stood several former board representatives connected to Julian's old structure. Months earlier, they would never have imagined asking Vanessa for help. Today, they waited for a meeting to request foundation participation in salvaging the remaining trust legacy. Some had once ignored her contributions. Others had accepted Julian's version of events without questioning it. Today, they waited for meetings, partnerships, and access to programs managed under her authority. None of them received automatic approval. Influence no longer belonged to assumptions. It belonged to merit. Preserve that. Later that afternoon, the foundation chair invited Vanessa to address the gathering. She stepped onto the stage wearing a tailored red blazer and paused briefly before speaking. Her remarks focused on stewardship, responsibility, and the importance of systems that outlast personalities. She never mentioned Julian. She never mentioned Isabella. She did not need to. The strongest victory had already happened. Their choices no longer defined her future. When the presentation ended, guests moved throughout the building while new partnership agreements were discussed. Vanessa eventually stepped outside onto a stone terrace overlooking the river. The water continued forward without hesitation. So had she. In the distance, the skyline reflected the late afternoon sun. Behind her stood an institution built on principles nobody could forge and nobody could inherit through manipulation. Ahead of her stood years of work she had chosen for herself. No more permission. Vanessa looked toward the entrance as another group of visitors arrived seeking guidance from the foundation she now led. Then she turned and walked back inside, not as someone reclaiming power, but as someone defining it. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.